All right, good day, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the second industrial revolution, society, and the world economy. And it's a very big topic. We're obviously covering a lot of ground here. Essentially, all these things are happening in the era that we call the Belle Epoch, the fin de Siecle, which is roughly 1870 to 1914. So it's bookended by the creation of the German Empire and the start of World War One. Now, it really was, to use a cliche, the best of times and the worst of times. There was a lot of optimism in some places. The rich were doing very well. Everybody was very excited about the future. But there was also a lot of fear and trepidation, and the idea that maybe liberalism wasn't working. There was a depression in the 1870s, Germany's growing power, and there was a feeling that maybe they were moving in the wrong direction, and maybe modernity wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. But the discussion that we're going to get today we're going to be talking specifically about the Industrial Revolution, which is happening in this era, how that is going to impact society and other changes in society. We're also going to see the way the government interacts with these ideas. And then tomorrow we'll get into the world economy. So to begin with, we're going to start with the Second Industrial Revolution, which really is from the second half of the 19th century into the 20th century. But here's the thing, some people don't like the term the Second Industrial Revolution. Some people say it's all one industrial revolution and it's just a continuation. But I will tell you the College Board does like the term the Second Industrial Revolution. So the second industrial revolution is marked by several new technologies they may not have all been invented right in this time, but they're coming into full bore. Mass production is becoming the norm. Assembly lines, interchangeable parts, which means can be used on more than one piece of equipment. Massive factories on a scale never before seen. Another new technology is the internal combustion engine. This is different from the diesel engine. This is different from the steam engine. This is going to allow the development of automobiles, planes, and it's really going to fuel manufacturing, no pun intended. Another new technology is new iron and new steel. There's a new improved smelting process, which is going to make iron easier to use. It's going to make better steel for railroads and for buildings. It's eventually going to allow the first skyscrapers. You call it Bessemer steel, but you don't need to know that. It also is eventually going to make better weapons, which we'll see. Another new development is electricity. It's been around for a little while, but we're going to see a rapid expansion after 1870. This, of course, is going to impact many industries, and it's going to become its own industry as it gets into the business and domestic sphere. I'll stop here. I feel like I'm going too fast. I'll give you a second to catch up. The fifth new technology that's really going to be pushed during this era is chemicals. And in this field, the Germans really lead the way. The first synthetic product manufactured was morvine. It was a purple dye. It was actually the first time in human history we had an artificial purple dye, which might not have sounded like a big deal, but it was. And it made William Henry Perkin a lot of money. Fertilizers are going to change the way people use crops, and it's going to influence food production. Explosives, TNT specifically, developed by Alfred Nobel, the guy who the prize is named after. He actually put together that prize, the Peace Prize, to try to make up for his destructive invention. And vulcanized rubber, that's adding sulfur to rubber, which is going to greatly influence the automobile industry and also the exploitation of the Belgian Congo, because now rubber is really important. But that's another story. So now the new industries that come about from this, electricity, utility companies, water, power companies, chemical, automobile, leisure, travel is going to come around for the first time as travel gets less expensive and as people are making more money. And professional sports are going to develop also. So I want you to take a second and talk about with your partner, what impact are these new industries going to have on society? So take a minute, pick a couple, two, three of them, and talk about what impact you think that is going to have. Okay. Communication is another huge factor of the second industrial revolution, incredible advancements in communication. Now, it actually starts a little bit before. The telegraph, was developed in the 1840s, and Morse code along with it. But the first transatlantic cable was actually laid down in 1858. I think this is really pretty cool. This, as it says, it cut down the communication time to a matter of minutes. And so instead of having to send a ship one way and then back the other way, which could take 10 days, if everything went well, now it cut it to a matter of minutes. So this was a huge development in communications. The telephone was developed by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. And then the radio was becoming popular in the 1880s. And that was going to have a big impact on mass communications. The big impact of all these is they shrink Europe down and they shrink the globe. We talk a lot today about mass communications and telecommunications and the interwebs and how it shrinks the globe. And these developments shrunk the globe to the people of that era just as much as the interwebs shrinks it for us today. So it was just as impactful and just as fast. Another area where the second industrial revolution had a great impact was that of transportation. Steamships is one of the big ones. This is the era of the Titanic, was in 1911. And these transatlantic steamships for transportation of goods and people were huge. Streetcars were developed in the 1880s, and that's what these pictures are of, streetcars using first a horse carriage on track and later electricity once those got powered. And these mass transportations changed the face of cities. Automobiles, the first mass-produced automobile in 1910. It's not going to impact the masses as much, but it is going to have an impact on cities and eventually even more. And again, these transportations shrink the globe. They make it smaller. They make transportation more effective. We're also another feature of the second industrial revolution is the seat of industrial power. So Great Britain, France, and Germany are what we call the inner zone in this. They account for 70% of the European market and 70% of world manufacturing output. They were far and away the three most powerful as far as manufacturing, as far as economically speaking. Great Britain was way ahead early on, but as the 19th century wore on, Germany starts pulling ahead of Great Britain. Their larger land, their population, just their development. But by the 20th century, the United States, as you can see on this chart, is growing faster than both of them. And so they are the new kid in town. They are the new powerhouse here, the new growing powerhouse. So the question now, as we look back at the second industrial revolution here, I want you to talk about what was the second industrial revolution. The College Board asked you to describe the second industrial revolution. How would you? And then in addition to that, talk about how was it different from the first industrial revolution that we did a few weeks ago. Okay, during this time, we're also going to see an expansion of government functions. And this is a continuation of a discussion we've been having really since the beginning of the year, a continuation of our centralization, of the government centralizing more and more power into their hands, more and more duties, more and more activities. And this is really the creation of the modern bureaucratic state, that is government intervention at every level of society. It's government intervention at every level of society. This is what we're familiar with today. When you're born, you get a Social Security card. They regulate your shots, school, your driver's license, your Social Security benefits, welfare, Medicaid. What we are familiar with as the modern bureaucratic state really comes into being during this time. So this idea of laissez-faire governments, well, it has been giving way. Now it's during this era that it gives way fully to interventionists, that means getting involved, economic and social policies. And the College Board really emphasizes that this is the era that happens. Now, one of the byproducts of this is it creates a need for educated civil servants. If you're going to have this much government involvement, you're going to need people to regulate it. You're going to need people to work the offices and all of these things. And so we're going to see compulsory education, that is mandatory education, become a cornerstone of government policies. That's another huge level of government involvement. Prussia began this in the 18th century, and then Germany centralized it after they became a state. England went through this process in the 1870s, and France a little bit later in the 1880s. This is, like I said, another level of government involvement, and it's also going to meet the rising need for civil servants, for these people to work the government that is now this massive, very involved institution in people's lives. Another very big, important area of government involvement is their support of industry and trade. Much like way back when the government supported the East India companies and the different trade companies, governments are going to help build railroads. They're going to get tax incentives to build factories. They're going to make trade agreements between countries. And so the government is increasingly involved in the economy. They are supporting private industry and private trade. They're working together, public-private working together. And that's a development that takes huge steps during this era. Another big aspect that they do, we saw started during the Industrial Revolution, during the reforms of the Industrial Revolution, is states are going to modernize their infrastructure and regulate public health. Stuff like sewage and water systems. These are some of the first ones that were done in England and in Paris. They're going to put in, this is the one in Paris. They're going to put in public lighting, outdoor, first gas lighting, then electric lighting, public housing for people too poor to afford their own homes, subsidized, public transportation, again, going back to those streetcars, and then even parks. During the Industrial Revolution, we mentioned how there was decreasing green space, and cities start to protect those, governments start to protect those. So of that list there, what I want you to do, what impact are those going to have on society? Sewage and water systems, public lighting, public housing, transportation, parks. With your partner, talk about what impact those are going to have. Okay, the next conversation to have is about social changes at this time. And this is the last part of our conversation that we're going to get through today. One of the big ideas that's coming really into full fruition during this era is class identity. Class identity is becoming stronger, just as much as nationalism, more so than religion, more so than town. Now, nationalism is still of paramount importance, but class identity is growing. You have the upper class, which are clearly defined. You have a growing middle class, and then you have the working class. And the interaction between all of these is important, because you have the middle class that wants to differentiate itself from the working class that wants to try to become more like the middle class. There's a lot of interesting dynamics here. An important point is the political parties that come to represent these. Different political parties emerge to represent different classes. Again, different political parties emerge to represent different classes. In England, you have the Conservatives and the Liberals, but during this time, the Labour Party, L-A-B-O-U-R, is also for the working class. So these parties emerge to represent the different groups that are there. Another social change is gender relations. These are going to change the way the genders relate to each other. Now, there's long, of course, been differences between men and women in their roles in society, but it's during this time we have the institutionalization of what we call the cult of domesticity. And this is a term that the College Board uses. This is where there's separate spheres for males and females. For males, it's the public sphere. They're supposed to be out. They're supposed to be making money. They're supposed to be doing things. And for females, it's in the home. That is their realm. That is their sphere. Now, this is obviously an upper and middle class ideal that the working class really couldn't get to. The woman is supposed to stay at home and be pure and submit to her husband. That's what the cult of domesticity is about. At the same time, we're seeing a rise in what we call compassionate marriages, especially in the middle class and the working class. People are getting married not just for economic benefit, but actually because they, like each other and want to be around each other. And we're also going to see the rise of feminism, both as political and social movements. And this is for rights for women, both social, political, economic rights for women as political and social movements. This is just some images of the cult of domesticity. Kind of gives an idea of the woman's realm in the home, and you see the man is reading to the family, and the lady's book telling them how to live a good life, and it's a magazine actually telling them how to uphold the cult of domesticity. The next one we're going to talk about is education. Now, we already talked about education as an expansion of government functions, compulsory education. But now I want you to take a second and talk with your partner. What cultural impact would mandatory schooling, have on society? What is that going to do to families? What is it going to do to society? Take a minute and talk about that with your partner. So some of the big ones I think are obviously kids not working, kids having to go to school, the impact that's going to have on family relations, on work relations, on labor relations. On another level, it's going to create the need for more teachers, which are more government civil servants. But it also is going to create an idea of improvement, that you can get better, that you can do better than a generation before you. It's also going to promote nationalism because these schools are for the government and by the government, and that's what they're teaching. So there's a lot of cultural impact that education is going to have also. Now, another idea that we have to talk about, society in the second industrial revolution, is the development of new leisure time and activities. With reforms in wages and hours that came about just a couple units ago, there's this new development that even the working class has time to go out and play. We actually call it 8 hours for what we will. That was the big movement to limit to an 8-hour day. 8 hours for work, for rest, for what we will. 8 hours for leisure. So this is a new development. And we're going to see all kinds of different leisure time activities rise up. Parks, sports clubs, beaches, department stores that are selling consumer goods that people now can afford. Museums, theater, opera, leisure travel. What I want you to do right now is take a few of these and talk about who is the target audience for each one of these new leisures. Who are they trying to appeal to for these? I think it's interesting if you could indulge me to talk about sports for a minute here. One of the big ideas is most competitions were played during the day, during the week. And so these were not working class leisure activities. They actually were purposely priced out. Even weekend games were priced in a way to keep the working class out because the people who ran them didn't want those unwashed masses at them. Which in America, when we see the development of the NFL come out on Sunday, is why it appealed to a much broader base of people. Interestingly, also, and Mr. Jones, you'll appreciate this, one of the other big new leisures to come about from this was cycling. This was one of the big new leisure hobbies, and it expanded people's horizons. They could go out on the road and they could get away from the towns, um, and so there was a lot of new opportunities. And the picture here in the middle, this is Harrods department store in England, which is a department store to go to buy consumer goods, but it also was an event. Here's a public beach, and you look at those bathing suits that are pretty ridiculous there. And then the fair down here, the little carnival. Um, so largely, it was a combination of both government and private organizations that rose up to meet the new demands of leisure. Governments building roads, maintaining beaches, private enterprises running ballparks, department stores. So it was a combination of both that rose up to meet these. And the last social development for us to talk about is the recognition of what we call the deserving poor, what they called at the time the deserving poor. Those were the people who deserved help, orphans, invalids, children in general, people who couldn't maintain themselves. So this is another step of government intervention, also private intervention, but to try to help the destitute, try to meet the needs, that industrialization, trying to help those who were left behind, but it still was leaving out able-bodied men that felt they should be able to work. And so, again, it was helping those who deserve help in society's eyes. And once again, a combination of government and private organizations rose up to meet demand, everything from soup kitchens, to welfare groups. A lot of times these were ethnic welfare groups. The Irish, the Polish, Germans had ones for themselves in their countries and in America as well. So now this is the end of day one. We talked about government intervention. We talked about the second industrial revolution. We talked about the social changes that these things all brought about. So you'll be looking at a worksheet tonight of the second industrial revolution, and we will talk about the global economy tomorrow. Okay, today we are going to start our conversation talking about the global economy. And to understand the global economy, we need to talk about the gold standard. This is a very, very important thing to talk about. And it's really important to understand really for now through the Cold War as far as global economics go. The entire international economy worked because of international acceptance of the gold standard. Not everybody accepted it, but enough people accepted it that it was the standard. The way it worked, and you'll have to listen to me here, you have to hear me out. A rate was set, and all established currencies have equal value. So one British pound was worth the same as one Deutschmark, was worth the same as one franc, was worth the same as $1. There was a set amount of gold that was worth each of those currencies. We can say it was an ounce. It wasn't an ounce. It was much, much smaller than that. But let's just, for simplicity's sake, say 1 ounce was worth $1, 1 franc, 1 kronen, 1 lira, 1 whatever it might be. So all of these different currencies were just like different languages expressing the same word. And that word was for that amount of gold. And this is going to make transfer to any currency to gold really easy. And you could transfer it back, and you could transfer between currencies. They were all the same. What we have today is called floating currencies. And this is going off the lecture a little bit. When you go to an airport and you exchange your money, you look and see what the exchange rate is. How many dollars to euros, how many dollars to pounds, whatever it might be. But that wasn't the case then. They were all worth the same amount of gold. And they were all worth the same. So take a second right now and make sure you understand that. We'll take time here to answer any questions about that. Now, hopefully we have a basic understanding of the gold standard. And one of the key ideas to the gold standard is it keeps inflation down. Now remember, again, inflation means as the supply of money goes up, the value of money goes down, so prices go up. That's inflation. But the gold standard is going to keep inflation down because you can only print as much money as you have gold. So you need to have gold to what's called back your money. So let's explain this. You could not print a dollar. You couldn't print a British pound unless you had that pound worth of gold in your reserves. Those of you who have heard of Fort Knox, that's where America keeps its gold reserves. When we were on the gold standard, that's where we kept our gold that we backed up our dollars to. And every country that printed money that was on the gold standard could only print their money if they had the gold in reserve. If you didn't have gold in reserve and printed money, they called those greenbacks because they were backed by nothing but the green paper that they were printed on, and they were considered worthless. But very few countries did that anymore, or at this point, because of the international acceptance of the gold standard. So again, take a second here and talk about what it means to be able to print money, reserve currency, gold on reserve. Make sure you understand what that idea is, and ask any questions you have about it. Now, while the gold standard was fairly universally accepted, it wasn't without its detractors. It's what we call the golden debate. The gold standard was obviously very difficult on countries without gold. If you didn't have any, it was hard to be an active member in the global economy. So much of Latin America was out of luck because Europe stole all of its gold. Same too with Africa. Europe stole all of its gold. So the gold was really concentrated in a handful of countries. It was also very difficult on those who relied on borrowing. Now, just take my word for this. The group that's most impacted on this is farmers, because they rely on borrowing. I'm going to give you more detail than you need right now, but I'll just real quick explain this. Farmers are in a perpetual state of borrowing. They always have to borrow at planting time for equipment, for fuel, for seed, for fertilizer. They borrow and then they pay back at harvest time. Therefore, farmers want inflation. They want money to decrease in value because then the money they pay back is worth less, is not worth as much as the money they borrowed. Because of inflation, the worth has gone down. So again, that's more than you need to know, but just understand that it's very difficult on those who rely on borrowing, especially farmers. Okay, I'll tell you the story of why the Wizard of Oz is down here in a second and who this good-looking young man is here. However, the gold standard is very good for the wage earner, that is the factory worker, because it keeps inflation and prices low. So they like the gold standard. Factory workers, wage earners like the gold standard. So we have this conflict between rural and urban that's really coming to a head at this point. So now I'm going to tell you a quick story. It's really U.S. history, and the U.S. history teachers probably get ticked that I tell it, but it's too good of a story for me to pass off. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it. And when your U.S. teachers bring it up next year, just pretend like you hadn't heard it before and sound surprised. The Wizard of Oz is actually an allegory for populism about the gold standard. So here I am. I'm going to ruin this story for you, all right? Frank L. Baum was a populist, and he's telling this story about the gold standard. Let's start with the heroine, Dorothy. She's from Kansas. She's a sweet, innocent farmer, represents everything that's good, in America. She gets swept up in this tumultuous maelstrom of a storm, and she's dropped in this mystical land called, Oz. And of course, we measure gold by its weight in ounces, and the abbreviation for ounces is, of course, OZ. That's right. And when she lands, her house lands on the Wicked Witch of the East first. And the Wicked Witch of the East represents the Eastern banking interests that wanted to keep the gold standard. And that's why she was wicked. To get the answer, she, of course, is told to follow the yellow brick road, which looks conspicuously like gold bricks to me. And she is wearing on her feet silver slippers. In the movie, they were red to take advantage of Technicolor, the new technology. But in the book, they're actually silver because some people wanted to expand not just to gold, but also to silver because they thought that would help as well. Along the way, she meets three friends. The first one is the Scarecrow. He represents the mindless farmer who doesn't even know what is good for him. That's why he wants a brain. She meets the Tin Man, who is the heartless industrial worker who doesn't know what's good for everybody in society. And then she meets the Cowardly Lion, who actually represents this guy, William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president 3 times promising to get rid of the gold standard. He was a populist. But it never worked, and so his bark was much worse than his bite. His roar was much worse than his bite, much like the Cowardly Lion. They're looking for the Emerald City, which represents greenbacks, the color. And along the way, they're, of course, harassed by the Wicked Witch in the West being where all the gold was from, California and later Alaska. So the whole thing is an allegory for populism. The last one, the flying monkeys. Tragically, those were real. America was plagued by flying monkeys during the early 20s. No, just kidding. But anyway, so that's the idea. The gold standard was still a big debate to some at the time. Now, to wrap it all up, it's a global economy, a world market. Never had the world been so interconnected economically. Excuse me. It was a high point of free trade. Europe had never been more open economically. Goods, services, capital, and people moved without regards to borders. It was like there were no borders. Where there was money to be made, people were totally okay with it. They were open to it. And nationalist policies took a backseat to liberal economics. I'm going to say that one more time. Nationalist politics took a backseat to liberal economics. I want you to take a second and talk about that with your partner. What does that mean? Explain that. Nationalist politics. We just did the era of nationalism. They took a back seat to liberal economics. You see the chart here is showing tariffs just going down, down, down. And so international business is going to be increased incredibly. The caption of this political cartoon is John Bull and his friend Cleveland, President Cleveland. A free trade message to Congress. They want free trade. So we see this as the triumph of liberal capitalism with no central planning. Liberal capitalism with no central planning. That's as opposed to socialism. I have that on there too. As opposed to socialism. But it's important to remember it was supported by government policy and intervention, by reforms, by trade policies. This is not laissez-faire, but it's also not a central planned socialist economy. Now, that being said, there were problems with this. The system was very precarious. Workers faced unemployment in every downturn. There were cycles of boom and bust. The economy would go up and it would go down. And that happens whenever you have a system based on credit, which is what the system was largely based on. And when people can't pay, the system collapses. And there's actually a 20-year economic downturn between 1873 and 93. It was the largest economic downturn of the modern era, so far, that is. And so it wasn't all booming economic times. We also see protective tariffs, like Frederick List's, which you read about, the national system in Prussia, and also colonies. Both of these things, some protective tariffs and colonies, are starting to interrupt free trade, and that is going to lead us to a situation where countries aren't trading as much with each other, and so they might be more willing to go to war with each other for the resources. So that gets us up to the end of our economic conversation, which kind of gets us right up to 1914. We're going to spend the rest of this unit talking about cultural, social, artistic, intellectual movements of the era. But this lecture really pretty much covered all of the economics all the way up to the eve of World War I. I hope you enjoyed it.